Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with part 5 of A World Journey, African Trails by the Imperator AMORC. An article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 32, Number 5, May 1954. The Thought of the Month, African Trails by the Imperator AMORC. This article is the 5th of a series being written by the Imperator after his return from a world journey in behalf of the Rosicrucian Order. Editor. We are accustomed to making a distinction between what we consider as primitive culture and civilization. It is as though when certain conditions have been compiled with or exist, there abruptly begins that society which we call civilized. As a noted ethnologist has remarked, there is no society which is without culture. Consequently, all peoples are civilized to a degree if, by that designation, we mean variation of refinement of their natural desires and impulses. It is not so many decades ago that America was referred to, in certain European cultural circles, as a land whose customs and people, by contrast, were primitive. Each society then is considered less civilized in relation to those whose standards are accepted as higher. From the sociological and philosophical points of view, what constitutes a civilized society? Shall it consist only of its technological progress, its electronic devices, transport and communication facilities, its mass production of commodities? For centuries, and today, there has been an implication that the religion of a people was indicative of their cultural superiority. This superior religion in the West, of course, was conceived as being Christianity. However, the art of Christianity, for example, as well as many of the doctrines, is syncretic. These have been borrowed outright from the East, and from the religion of Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Mohammedanism, and the early mystery schools. Civilization, then, is the moving development of mankind. This development is the refinement of man's natural appetite and passions by their circumvention and discipline through the application of the reason. Civilization is a gradual cultivation of the intellectual powers and what we term conscious, or the moral sense. This distinction between man and the lower animals is the fuller expression of the former self-consciousness, with its subsequent moral, ethical, and aesthetic idealism. This idealism is not necessarily concomitant with material and scientific progress. Among people who are economically impoverished and almost wholly lacking in scientific achievement, there may often be found strong moral impulses and aesthetic values. They may be termed pagan or even primitive, and yet in no sense are wholly uncivilized. As we observe and study these less developed cultures, the primitive, we see reflected our own past, and we are often proud of what we have since achieved. We are likewise at times made very much aware of these natural heritages, which we have sacrificed to gain what are said to be the rewards of our civilized society. Kenya's nomadic culture. Kenya in British East Africa was to afford us another opportunity for the study of man in his indigenous habitat. The Crown Colony of Kenya was formerly an East African protectorate. It was held by Britain under the concession of the Sultan of Zanzibar to the Imperial British East African Company from 1888 to 1920, subsequently becoming a crown colony. Its capital and principal city is Nairobi, which is situated in the highlands. The latitude of Kenya varies from sea level on the Indian Ocean to a plateau of 9,000 feet. Nairobi, being on the highlands, is not only healthful, but in having normally sufficient rainfall and being adjacent to fertile lands, it also holds a strategic place in the colony. The city, though having a population of 119,000, gives the visitor the impression of being much smaller. Its modern facilities, paved streets, and shops of international wares, however, contrast with customs and conditions which have changed little with the passing of centuries. There is a graduation of European culture, diminishing towards the city limits and abruptly stopping thereafter. The center of the city is representative of Western culture. However, as one approaches the limits of Nairobi, one sees such stratum of society and standards of living as constitute a hybrid of the cruder methods with those which are more prosperous and progressive. So far as the white or European population of Nairobi and surrounding territory is concerned, the city is kind of oasis in a thinning populated area. Only 4 miles from Nairobi is the Great National Park by the same name. This park is actually a large undeveloped area in which droves of game roam and live in their natural state. Herds of zebras, thousands of gazelles, impalas, and wildebeest, giraffes, and lions are to be seen, as well as innumerable species of smaller game. A huge wire fence extending for several miles alone keeps these animals from entering the city. In years past, hungry beasts attacked unarmed natives and children within the bounds of Nairobi. The principal tribes of Kenya, the Kikuyu and Maasai, like most primitive people, are pastoral and nomadic. The more primitive is the man, the more he is inclined, like the animals about him, to accept the bounties and adversities of nature as he finds them. This, of course, mostly due to the lack of knowledge of the phenomena of nature and how to employ them to his needs. The primitive mind, in its first ascent, may become familiar with a phenomenon, know when to expect its effects, and yet be quite ignorant of its causes. This ignorance, usually combined with a terrifying assumed knowledge of the causes, prevents an early hastening of the natural forces. Consequently, the primitive human lives off the land as flora and fauna, not greatly unlike the beast around him, driving herds of cattle and flocks of sheep before them. The primitive peoples are always in search of better pasturage. The natives for centuries have led such nomadic existence, having no permanent dwelling, art, architecture, and handicraft products of a more stable existence. They are slow in developing. Native family life. In Kenya and the Tanganyika territory, the latter belonging immediately to the south of the former, the dwellings and living areas of the natives are of 2 general kinds. One of these, and the crudest, is known as a boma. It consists of a large oval area fenced with brush varying in size. The brush is usually stacked to form an enclosure 6 feet in height and about 2 or 3 feet in thickness. The brush is cut from the dry shrubs which abound on the African belt in this region. Those shrubs which contain long, sharp thorns are preferred. When stacked, the bush makes a formidable barrier, the primitive equivalent of the military barbed wire entanglements. In one section of the oval enclosure is the opening, besides which is placed a movable stack of the brush to form a gate. The enclosure is tended to keep out large predatory animals, such as the lion. At night, the opening to the enclosure is blocked with the brush gate. In the center of this oval, which varies with the size and number of families, the Maasai, for example, build their huts. Each of these provides accommodations for 1 or 2 families. These huts are constructed of mud and cow dung, held together, or rather reinforced, with long strands of dry grass. These structures vary in height from 4 to 5 feet. They are, therefore, only high enough for a man to kneel or to be seated on the ground. The entrance is small with no door, requiring one to crawl or stoop low to enter. A few feet inside is a part wall, which is directly in front of the entrance, forming a barrier to partly keep out the rain and, incidentally, much of the air. As one looks in, it is dark, foul in its odors, and far less inviting than the kennel of the average dog in Europe or America. The boma at night serves as a corral for the cattle as well as a protected area for the natives. The cattle are rounded up and driven through the aperture in the bush enclosure. The natives crowd into their dark huts, and the bellowing cattle are herded into the compact area against and between the foul-smelling dwellings. We well recall our first intimate association with a boma. Heavy, ominous rain clouds hung low over the slightly rolling terrain. The soil was a rust red. The long drought had made it powdery. We were on safari. Our station wagon was loaded high with camera equipment, sound recorder, sleeping bags, food supplies, and numerous incidentals. The available space cramped us, and our native Kikuyu guide, Johannes. We welcomed the sudden stopping by Johannes because it was a relief from the constant jarring caused by the unpaved and corrugated roads. As we stopped, the cloud of swirling red dust, which moved in the vacuum of our wake, engulfed us. We were already ochre in color, and this deepened the layers of red dust on our faces and clothing. Boma, said Johannes, laconically, and pointed with one sweep of his arm. It was some distance away, perhaps a quarter of a mile. At first it was difficult to distinguish it from the wild brush, scrub trees, and dead limbs scattered about the terrain as far as the eye could see. The vista had not changed for the last hour. It was the same view we had seen for miles. Standing now upon the ground, we stretched and enjoyed the liberation from our cramped positions in the station wagon. We started from the roadside out across the terrain to the brush enclosure. Our first realization of the filth in the boma came to us on the wings of the breeze while yet some distance away. The stench from animal and human excretion increased in proportion to our approach. Cattle in the region are tormented by virtually clouds of flies and other winged insects which descend upon them, particularly in the dry season, since the cattle are kept in the boma. That and the accumulation of filth in the enclosure causes these insects to breed. They're in tremendous quantities and hover over the animals. When we were within 20 feet of the opening in the brush oval, we were detected by the flies, and within a few seconds we were sheathed in a buzzing, sticky, stinging, crawling mass of them. They had risen like a cloud from the foul refuse on the ground within the boma to light upon us. They are not warded off by striking at them. One brushes, or perhaps a better verb would be, peels them off in handfuls from his face. They seek moisture and try to crawl into the mouth and the corners of the eyes. Since one species of these flies, the tsetse, is the transmitter of lethargic encephalitis, or sleeping sickness, which is prevalent in certain areas, the experience had its threat as well as being repugnant. The Maasai occupants who stood staring at us, or who pushed out of their huts to look at us with some curiosity as we did at them, were covered with crawling insects. They, however, seemed impervious to them. Small children and infants barely able to walk had clusters of them at the corners of their eyes, and flies were actually crawling in and out of their mouths. The children would occasionally blink when the flies entered the eye proper, but neither they nor their parents sought to prevent them. We were forced to put our equipment on the ground to free our hands, in a futile attempt to rid ourselves from this repugnant assault. Our gestures were amusing to the natives. The Maasai, in their primitive state, live mostly on milk and meat. The container in which the milk is placed is a narrow, elongated leather sack, similar to those used for thousands of years for like purpose. In the Rosicrucian Egyptian Oriental Museum may be seen illustrations from tomb walls of nobles of 2000 BC, where workers on their estates carry elongated leather pouches similar in appearance to the ones possessed by the Maasai natives to contain milk and other liquids. There is no attempt at sanitation. Flies are naturally attracted by the milk which splashes down the edges of the pouch, and they cluster about its top. A parent, in offering a child milk, merely takes her unclean hand and brushes off the flies, and then allows the child its fill. The wealth of a native anywhere in Africa who is still quite primitive is not determined by land, but the number of cattle he possesses. As a consequence, the natives neglect the land by overgrazing it and then proceed to abandon it. This accounts for the numerous deserted bomas we find scattered throughout Kenya. During the day, the cattle are guarded by statuesque Maasai warriors or young lads to whom this great responsibility is entrusted. They are usually seen standing erect, holding an assegai, a short spear like a javelin for throwing, or a much larger and heavier one like a lance. These are intended to be used in killing predatory animals which would attack the cattle. Wild game are not the only threat to the herds. Marauding tribesmen will steal the cattle at every opportunity. Such acts constitute a serious menace as they are likely to precipitate an intertribal war. European influence. The other form of native dwelling is commonly referred to as a banda. It is a more evolved type of structure. Some of them definitely show the influence of European associations. The banda is either round or square, but with a thatched roof. It is the one commonly shown in fictional motion pictures, simulating African native dwellings. The boma is too primitive and perhaps too repulsive for the average cinema production to present to its audiences. The banda has an actual but narrow door. There are no windows except in those which adjoin European or white communities where the influence of evolved architecture is stronger. The floor is usually the natural earth, which, from continual usage, becomes hard-packed. A banda is high enough for the occupants to stand erect. It is not lighted except for what daylight enters through the door. The whole family occupies the one-room banda. This kind of dwelling is principally occupied by the non-nomadic tribes, those who have become localized and till the soil. In other words, they show the effect of their European associations. The women may wear dresses and the men trousers and shorts, but rarely shoes. The Maasai are more physically appealing, that is, attractive, than, for example, the Kikuyu. They are tall, 6 feet or more, slender, and lithe and generally muscular in build. Their features are sharp and reflect intelligence. If they were in Western attire and properly groomed, they would be accepted in any cultured liberal society insofar as their appearance is concerned. However, the Maasai are generally not concerned with how much dirt they have accumulated upon their person. In the dry season, they are often covered with the indigenous red dust. We recall, on occasion, when back in the brush, being held by a lone Maasai. We stopped to determine his needs. He wanted to ride some little distance to his boma. He carried on a conversation with Johannes, our native god, in Swahili, a dialect understood by all the tribes. His hair was worn long and plaited, and was coated with a kind of ogre paste, giving it a hideous appearance. He wore a woven cloth which hung from one shoulder, which never gets laundered. His legs, feet, arms, and right shoulder were bare. He had smeared some substance as a shiny paste on his face, and the flies swarmed around it and his head like a halo. When he put his head into the station wagon to speak, the flies followed. The fact that we were violently trying to drive them away without success did not impress him. We were very much relieved when Johannes pointed out to him that there was absolutely no accommodation for extra passengers. He withdrew and raised his arm in a salute of farewell as we departed in a cloud of dust and flies. The Kikuyu, having overspread their reservations, have come into conflict with the Maasai, who are not as aggressive a people. Cattle stealing from each other by the tribes has become a dangerous sport in which the young warriors like to indulge. The white authorities have not been successful in suppressing the practice. The cattle are not branded by the natives with any insignia or mark to indicate ownership. It is difficult, therefore, for the guilt to be determined unless the thieves are detected in the act. We had departed from the unpaved road and were now crossing open territory. The only roads before us, if it could be designated by that appellation, consisted of the tracks of previous vehicles in the soft red soil. Nowhere was there any sign of habitation, not even a boma. Low shrubs, like the sagebrush of the prairies of western United States, formed a checkered pattern extending to the distant horizon on every side. Here and there was a savanna, an elevated area, treeless and desolate. The trees that were to be seen were typical of those throughout this region. relatively short and with foliage clustered at the top of the trunk. They are so even at the top that the trees give an appearance of having been cropped uniformly by some instrument. Being early spring and at a comparatively high altitude, the temperature did not exceed any time 80 Fahrenheit. The dust was extremely irritating to the nostril passages and the eyes. We had to moisten handkerchiefs and hold them over our noses to filter out the clouds of dust. We could not wear goggles because the dust would obscure our vision. The color of such foliage as did exist was hard to determine unless one vigorously shook a plant or shrub to remove its coating of soil. We were entering Ambosli, a large game reserve. It is an area set aside for the game in its natural habitat. The game was not nearly as plentiful as in Nairobi National Park. The drought had severely affected the water holes, most of which in this immediate region had dried to a mere cracked soil cavity. The animals, as the zebra, giraffe, gazelle, and baboon, had retreated to the distant mountains where rainfall was more plentiful. The dark clouds suddenly parted in there, like an island in the sky, with an aura of light about it. Its lower extremities not visible was Mount Kilimanjaro. Its black crown is covered with snow. It is not nearly as fascinating or majestic as the great peaks to be seen in Switzerland, the American Rockies, the Andes, or the Himalayas. An extensive volcano in the remote past. It had erupted and blown off its conical top. Mount Kilimanjaro has an altitude of about 19,500 feet and is the highest point of the African continent. We looked at it quizzically, but to the thousands of eyes before our time and to the thousands of natives who could see it when the sky is clear, it was a supernatural personality. Its height, attaining majesty as it towers above the plateau, to them was ominous, suggested perhaps by the rugged mystery of its great mass. About it, to these similar peoples, there was an eternal aura of legends, myths, and tales of terror. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.